Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 26th of October in the 43rd week of 2012. For more than 20 years, our program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and Ron Szoke. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news that's been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then giving the others a chance to comment on it. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years we've been on the air. If you saw Democracy Now! Today on UPTV, you saw a recent talk by Chomsky on politics in general, and indeed that's also available online, and I recommend it. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today was I worked on this too, I really did. Eid al-Adha, there we go. Eid al-Adha, that's as close as I'm going to come. The Muslim festival commemorating the Prophet Ibrahim's willingness to sacrifice his son to Allah. Remember, of course, that Allah is the word that an Arabic-speaking Christian or Jew would use for God. It's not a proper name. It is rather simply the Arabic word for God. And Ibrahim, of course, is Abraham, familiar to us from the Hebrew Bible, and that indicates how closely historically aligned Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are. The leading American historian of Judaism, Jacob Neusner, puts it that all three are daughters, as it were, of the religion of ancient Israel. And he notes provocatively but accurately that Christianity is the eldest daughter, given the formation of Rabbinic Judaism in the period of the 2nd to the 6th centuries of the Common Era, produced the Talmuds, and Islam in the 7th century of the Common Era. So, you're watching News from Neptune, the Eid Mubarak, Happy Eid edition. And Ron Szoke will sacrifice the first ram.
Well, I wanted to return to my frequent theme of inequality, the economic situation, and bring to you some thoughts from Joseph Stiglitz in a lengthy piece in today's New York Times, Why Some Are More Unequal Than Others. And he calls attention to the political discussion going on now between the candidates and why this fact of equality and the declining status of the middle class is not being mentioned in the debates. It indicates the degeneracy of our political discussion and debate, according to some. And it's one of those remarkable things, inequality and poverty, which should be a major issue, one would think, in this country, but is not mentioned at all or only indirectly in the presidential debates and the discussions and disputes that are going on. Some are more equal than others, Stiglitz said. I don't think I have to recite his credentials at this point, which are as high as anyone's could possibly be. But he points to these things that he calls myths. Again, that term is often misused, but I needn't go into that. That he wants to argue against. First of all, America is a land of opportunity, the kind of thing that we heard endlessly at the Republican National Convention. While rags and riches stories are still popular, he says, the fact of the matter is that the life chances of a young American are more dependent on the income and wealth of his parents than in any other of the advanced countries for which there's data. There's less upward mobility and less downward mobility from the top than in Europe, and we're not just talking about Scandinavia. The second one that he wants to question, trickle-down economics works, aka a rising tide lifts all boats. This suggests that further enriching the wealthy will make us all better off. America's recent economic history shows the patent falsehood of this notion. The top has done very well, but median American incomes are lower than they were a decade and a half ago. Third myth, the rich are job creators, so giving them more money leads to more and better jobs. This is really a subset of myth 2, he says, but Romney's own private sector history gives it the lie. Myth 4, the cost of reducing inequality is so great that as much as idealists would like to do so, we would be killing the goose that lays the golden egg. In fact, he says, the engine of our economic growth is the middle class. Inequality weakens aggregate demand because those at the middle and the bottom have to spend all of or almost all of what they get, while those at the top don't. The concentration of wealth in recent decades led to bubbles and instability as the Fed tried to offset the effects of weak demand arising from our inequality by low interest rates and tax regulation. So he says the irony of the tax cuts for capital gains and dividends that were supposed to spur investment by the wealthy alleged job creators didn't do so, even with record low interest rates. Private sector job creation under Bush was dismal. Mainstream economic institutions like the International Monetary Fund now recognize the connection between inequality and a weak economy. To argue the contrary is a self-serving idea being promoted by the very wealthy. Fifth point, markets are self-regulating and efficient, and any government interference with markets is a mistake. He says the 2008 crisis should have cured everyone of this fallacy, but anyone with a sense of history would realize that capitalism has been plagued with booms and busts since its origin. And indeed, some would say, including me, that boom and bust cycle, the business cycle, is an intrinsic feature of capitalism and will exist in some greater or less degree as long as there is anything reasonably called capitalism. Fifth and finally, okay, I guess that was it. As I have explained it elsewhere, he says, the cost of these myths goes beyond the damage to our economy now and in the future. The fabric of our society and democracy is suffering. The worry is that those at the top are investing their money not in real investments, in real innovations, but in political investments. In other words, the millions being poured into the political campaigns. On both sides, in particular, most spectacularly by a few oligarchs who are spending millions upon millions of dollars, especially on attack ads, attacking their opponents and trying to discredit them. So the thought has been then that what we need to overcome our economic difficulties, some would call it a crisis, is austerity, and a good deal is being said about the futility of that and the social consequences, which is what interests me, the decline in what I would call social morale, and what the austerity policy has led to is in Europe the abandonment of children, the rioting in Athens and in Madrid, and a curious, funny note, in Greece, the soccer clubs have lost funding, so now they are being supported by some of the whorehouses there. Sports financing, Larissa Greece brothels now sponsors of cash-strapped Greek teams. So some people in Greece don't like that, but that's where the money is coming from. And I wonder if these soccer players are wearing the little logos on their uniform or forms or something from Villa Erotica and Sola's House of History and so on. That would be kind of amusing. But anyway, what we have here is Mr. Romney's 5-point plan for American prosperity. And Krugman has pointed out that this is only a vague goal or aspiration. It's not a plan. So anyone who thinks that that's a plan should consider my candidacy for the presidency. Mine is to make everyone happy, healthy, wealthy, and wise. So that's my plan. Don't ask how I'm going to accomplish this. All I have to do is pronounce this and say it's my plan. So that's enough for now.
Thank you, Ron. Comments, David?
Well, I was going to bring up something about John Maynard Keynes, and then you brought up brothels, and I'm trying to figure out how to connect brothels to John Maynard Keynes, and perhaps he wouldn't appreciate that.
Good luck.
But during the post-World War II era, Keynes was seen either implicitly or explicitly, sort of implicitly politically, but explicitly among formal academic economists as being the answer to capitalism's ups and downs. And so the question that arises is what's happened in the last 3 or 4 decades, is it just a matter of we stopped applying Keynes, or that did Keynes fail us in some way? Did Keynesianism, so is Keynesianism the answer, or did it already fail us once? Krugman would say, yes, it is the answer to a certain extent. Many economists would agree partially to some extent, but what's your take on this?
Well, answer to what? I mean, inequality or the business cycle or what?
Yeah, well, the sort of this sort of moving away from the fundamentals of what economic growth in capitalism is supposed to be about.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that Keynes foresaw the capture of the government, the legislature, by the big contributors, the ultra-rich, and what that has led to. So I think about Keynes as about most people, that he's maybe half right, and we should look at him in a discriminating way and try to figure out what was right and what was wrong.
And of course, Keynes was working in England in which the government was very much in the hands of the big rich being the traditional aristocracy and the new capitalists, so to speak, which are essentially melded by the beginning of the 20th century, and that his government was certainly, the government he was dealing with was certainly no more democratic than ours is, although I think it's important for us to realize the extent to which the last generation has seen the progressive diminution of the of popular influence, certainly through the supposed mechanisms of democracy. The Europeans speak of a democratic deficit when you have the forms of democracy but no actuality of it. And of course, they gave a name to it, but we pioneered the thing itself and have done a particularly brilliant job of it. The remark of Chomsky's, and Chomsky is much on my mind today, not only because he is our resident deity, as it were, but because the things he's been saying in his 84th year have been particularly relevant, I think, to the sorts of questions that you were raising. He writes, or wrote a few years ago, "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum, even encourage the more critical and dissident views. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of the debate." Now that seems to me to capture in the abstract, as it were, exactly what we've been seeing in this campaign. there are an awful lot of our fellow citizens, certainly not a majority, but there are a significant number of our fellow citizens who think there's something really important at stake in this election, and it really will make a difference as to whether Mr. Romney or Mr. Obama is elected. In fact, we will have remarkably similar policies regardless of which man is elected president, just as we did after the last presidential election. Remember, an awful lot of Americans thought that the last election was about the Middle East wars, and that if we elected a peace candidate, someone to whom they would give a Nobel Peace Prize right away, we would have different policies in these wars. Well, we didn't. And the continuity of policy over the last generation of the American government, regardless of administration, is remarkably impressive. And it seems to me that it corresponds to the description that Chomsky offers. You have a very narrow limit of policy options, but within that you have a raging debate on whether this particular verbal formulation or that verbal formulation is truth or a tool of the devil, and that's all we got. And it's a game, it's a show, it's put on for the masses because, in fact, policy is insulated from politics in this country. The policies will continue with only the slightest changes. But the politics, that's there to confuse the rubes.
Yeah. Back to Keynes, did you see that the transcript of the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 in New Hampshire has been discovered, and it's published online now, apparently. And Keynes participated in that, and he apparently was part of this movement of transferring the dominance of the global economy from England to the USA.
Absolutely, and that's probably why we should, I'm not an authority on any of this. I know Chomsky always refers to the shapers of the post-World War II economic order as being John Maynard Keynes and a guy named Harry Dexter White.
You're right.
I know nothing about Harry Dexter White. It seems like somebody who shaped the post-World War II economic order is someone who we ought to know more about. Yeah. But then again, that gives us an understanding that there are people in the background, beyond the politics that Carl refers to. There are people in the background, maybe perhaps more well-known people like George Kennan and Averell Harriman and the other so-called wise men who did shape the post-war world, and certainly Keynes was among them in shaping it to be a more viable form of capitalism that he had experienced, obviously, through the 1920s and the crash then.
Do you think we're still experiencing some of the consequences of what was said and done at Bretton Woods?
Oh, yes, certainly. Absolutely. Bretton Woods gave us the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Right. They gave it, as David said, the economic order that defines the modern world. And, of course, the first question for us now to ask about that, when we have some more indication of how it was carried out, is cui bono? Who profits in both senses of the word? Whose interests were being served by what was being established in that conference? And in some sense, it's a transformation that is part of in a sense, the larger transformation the Second World War brought about, which was the transfer of the British Empire to the United States. In many ways, the Second World War was a war of British succession in the old European forms of designating wars, but this was a succession to the lead role in the imperialist world, in the capitalist world, that Britain had exercised from the 19th century. That was going away. It's fascinating to read even Churchill on that. Churchill knew perfectly well what the Americans were doing, and he knew from the day that he worked as hard as he could to bring them into the war, that if he brought them into the war, the American tail would end up wagging the British imperial dog, and he accepted that. He said, there's no other way, otherwise we're all speaking German. And so it's a consequence, the fundamental consequence of the Second World War in Europe is American hegemony. And what we're seeing today is the the decline of that hegemony. From 1945 to today, those people who talk about American decline are accurately describing what's happened. Now, decline here is relative because, in fact, it's the prominence of other societies and economies that allows us to speak of American decline. But if we're going to understand American policy, and if we're going to understand the policy of other states as well, we have to put it in a context that understands that history. In America, we talk about politics as if the president wakes up in the morning and has a good idea, and that's what American policy is. It's much more long-standing than that. It's much more continuous. You mentioned Chomsky's discussion of grand area planning, which is what the U.S. was doing at the beginning of the Second World War for what the world would be like after the Second World War. Now, those are other discussions that were only slowly published, and historians for the most part have not looked at. There's only one book I know that really examines that grand area planning of the early Second World War, and so to find the same thing going on in regard to the economic planning, which was what happened at Bretton Woods, is hardly surprising. But, you know, maybe we should suggest there be some attention paid to these things. You're watching News from Neptune, and we'll go perhaps to David Green.
Perhaps we will.
Perhaps we will.
That remains to be seen. But
going forward.
Yes, we are going forward. Okay. I'm really going to continue to a certain extent to what Ron has brought up. What's been on my mind has to do with even understanding what capitalism would look like if capitalism actually worked, and how it is that we've gotten so far away, even if one accepts the necessity for capitalism in terms of labor, profits, investment, and investment in increased productivity, what that would actually look like, and whether what we're doing now has any relationship to that at all. And increasingly, I wonder who really understands what the economic fundamentals are. I've been reading a book called The Age of Greed by a guy named Jeff Madrick, a long account of the last 40 years of sort of innovation, quote unquote, in financial matters, of which we've spoken about many times on this show, beginning those sorts of things which generally comprised deregulating, breaking down the barriers between banking, investment banking, Wall Street, and so forth, which have brought us to our current point. It's remarkable to even try to contemplate what it means in terms of a viable capitalist model, how we got to the point where during the midst of a housing bubble in which people were giving, which subprime mortgages were being dealt out, those mortgages were being securitized by the stock market, and then beyond that, those mortgages were being transformed, and I don't pretend any expertise at this, but I've come to a minimal understanding of it. They were being transformed into something called collateralized debt obligations, CDOs, which were ultimately the source of the wealth of the person, of the great wealth of the person, which I'm referring to here. His name is John Paulson. And John Paulson is worth $7 billion or so. And the way John Paulson, as a hedge fund manager a few years back, got several billion of those 7 billion was by getting Goldman Sachs, in fact, to bet against the housing market, to bet against the housing bubble. He was perceptive enough, if that's what you want to call it, to realize that this couldn't last, that the fundamentals weren't there. And he bet against it. It's called short selling. And he got Goldman Sachs to get a bunch of investors to bet that Paulson, would be wrong, and that the housing bubble would continue to grow, and that the people who took these subprime mortgages would be able to continue to pay, and that the party would go on and on and on. Many economists knew that it wouldn't, and John Paulson himself knew that it wouldn't. It took a year or two of his betting against the housing bubble to see his dreams come true. But when it did, when it came all crashing down, he profited by several $billion. Those several $billion came from somebody, but I think what's most important to understand is that those billions of dollars and all those billions of dollars that hedge fund managers of various types and Wall Street managers, including Mitt Romney of various type, make over the years represent the labor of the saved labor, if you will, of those of us who actually work and produce stuff, goods, services, all that kind of old-fashioned stuff that they don't talk about on Wall Street, and they don't talk about at hedge fund while they're devising these ways of making money out of money. So getting back to the basic idea that these billions of dollars, even beyond the fact of capitalists getting rich because they take their profits and invest them in better ways of doing things, ideally, and then everybody gets richer and they get richer. Well, no. These mortgages weren't invested in anything that produced anything. And so therefore, the money went, exorbitant amounts of money went to people who don't produce anything, while the society as a whole was left much poorer, which is shown in anything from the foreclosure rates to the job market to the value of people's homes and their individual savings and stock portfolios after the crash in 2008. Why did I get onto this John Paulson this week? Well, there was an article in the New York Times about him taking, out of his several $billion, taking $100 million of it and donating it to the Central Park Conservancy.
What a guy.
A trenchant comment made by a blogger on Reuters named Felix Salmon, assuming he doesn't want to be compared to some fish, but this is a very good comment. He says, John Paulson lives in a 28,500 square foot townhouse on the Upper East Side. He invested a lot into his townhouse, which hosted a big fundraiser for Mitt Romney in April. And now he's given even more to Central Park, $100 million to be precise. The park is very large, he explained to the New York Times, and its endowment is relatively small. Actually, at $144 million pre-Paulson, Central Park's endowment, I'm pretty confident in saying, Felix Salmon is saying, makes it the most lavishly endowed park in the world. Half of Paulson's gift is going to make that endowment even bigger. The other half will be spent on various capital improvements. Apparently, the entrance to the southwest corner is going to get spiffed up. And then he goes on to say, the fact is that if you wanted to give $100 million to charity while making the barest minimum impact on the world, you'd be hard pushed to improve on Paulson's performance today. Maybe he was inspired by Ronald Lauder across the street, who was just waiting for the perfect time to donate the Klimt painting he owns to the museum he founded, where it has been hung since he bought it. On the other hand, if you wanted to make a charitable donation expertly calibrated for its helpfulness with respect to your social climbing ambitions on the Upper East Side, then a splashy gift to the Central Park Conservancy could hardly be improved upon. The gift was announced with great fanfare. Mayor Bloomberg was there, etc. And he concludes, of course, this is a charitable deduction. It's a tax. It's a tax expenditure also. Right. I don't know what Paulson's marginal tax rate is, but in any case, if you multiply that by 100 million, you get the amount of money that taxpayers are being forced to contribute to John Paulson's 843-acre backyard in the form of foregone tax revenues. Is that the best use of public funds? Almost certainly not, but we don't have any choice. So it just, you know, I mean, we have to think of, you know, a word beyond chutzpah that goes several levels beyond that sort of just the relatively innocent word to describe the amount of money accumulated by people who do no work, produce nothing, destroy the economy while they're doing it, ought to be in jail, and then donate their money to get a further tax refund, basically.
And donate their money to improve what's essentially their front yard.
Yeah.
He lives in the Upper East Side in a townhouse, right? And it's the park that he's working on.
Exactly,
So,
exactly. And he visited the article in the New York Times while briefly mentioning the problems that Paulson had and how while Goldman Sachs was sued for this short selling, for misrepresenting these collateralized debt obligations, and Paulson was certainly at the bottom of that. Paulson got off the hook because he knew that these were bad, but it was Goldman Sachs that presented them as being worthwhile to these people who have eventually lost billions of dollars gained by John Paulson into his own pocket. So the New York Times article refers to that, along with referring to the fact that Paulson grew up in Queens and visited Central Park, and how he had this affection for wanting to maintain the place where he spent so many happy hours in his youth, so on and so forth.
And living in his walk up in Queens as he does today, why, no, I guess that's not true. Ron, you got a take on this?
No, I was just going to mention the same incident. What a hell of a nice guy. And to ask whether either of you saw the movie Arbitrage.
I haven't seen it.
Haven't seen it.
Yeah, well, it's another one of these guys who's ultra rich. Richard Gere plays this big investor who makes a wrong bet on a copper mine in Russia and winds up owing over $400 million to one of his fellow investors, and they find out about this, so he does something very foolish, running off with his mistress and so on, is in a car accident and on and on. But he's another one constantly being lauded, praised for all of his charitable contributions and so on. And it's really an engrossing and in a way shocking movie, so I would recommend it if you ever have a chance to see it.
This brings up two points that we've mentioned before, in all of us have, I think, in various ways here, and that the and has surfaced a bit in the presidential election in the discussion about taxing the very wealthy. And the most we've come to in that regard is the president's suggestion that the tax rates on income of the very wealthy should be adjusted upwards, you know, because they're so far below what they were within recent memory. But I've suggested before that, in fact, taxing income and even adjusting rates on income probably is not going to discomfort Mr. Paulson very much, and that if we want to do something serious about the massive redistribution upwards of wealth over the last 30 years, we're going to have to tax wealth. Tax what are called investable assets. That is, not your house and things of that sort of money you live on, but the money you use to play the stock market, the money your hedge fund uses. This and the possibilities of wealth tax are important and are not, of course, part of the discussion. Second aspect of this is the so-called Tobin tax, the tax on the very things that Mr. Paulson was busily doing, and the tax on financial activities. These things are absolutely necessary, obvious, and of course they've made up no part of the discussion in the presidential election.
A good intermediate step before we get to that would be to tax capital gains at the same rate as income.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
that would discomfort Mr.
It's notorious. This is why
yes.
Romney is paying a 14%
Yes.
tax rate, while the people who work for him are paying at least double that typically. And there's Warren Buffett's famous statement that his secretary
Right.
pays a higher tax rate than he does.
But it's back to the point that you raised to start with, Ron. It seems to me that the reason we're not having this discussion, the reason that Mr. Paulson is not in danger of having his wealth taxed anyway, is that is this this construction of a political attitude, this manufacture of consent to the present arrangements that has occurred not in the presidential campaign, not in the election campaign, but outside of it and around it, so that these issues are not even mentioned. They're not even brought up at it. There was an interesting parallel to this in the British press this weekend. The Guardian ran an interview with Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall is an academic who is a principal figure in the postmodern enthusiasm of the last academic generation. I don't think there are any living, breathing postmodernists left anymore, but the last one died off in an asteroid, some sort of intellectual asteroid struck, and all those Pomo dinosaurs perished. But Hall is an interesting guy, in fact. I mean, he was a leader of this group, and precisely because, unlike most of them, he had something interesting to say. And he's rising 80 now, and he was interviewed in the in the Guardian this weekend, and here's something of what he said. He, quote, "The left is in trouble. It's not got any ideas. It's not got any independent analysis of its own, and therefore it's got no vision." Now, we've just been talking about things the left might suggest, from taxing capital gains to taxing wealth, but still. It just takes the temperature, says Stuart Hall. Whoa, that's no good. Let's move to the right. Well, there's some truth in what people who see themselves, or some see as on the left, have been saying recently there. But he continues, it has no sense of politics being educative, of politics changing the way people see things, which, after all, is what you started with, Ron. He says, the examples of this are everywhere, but take as the most pressing the case of the NHS. The NHS is the National Health Service in Britain, their essentially single-payer system for health care, the sort of thing that all advanced capitalist countries have, except, of course, ours. Hall says, how can millions of people have benefited from the NHS and not be on the streets to defend it? Because the British government, the sitting British government, is trying to do to social supports just what the sitting American government is trying to do to social supports. President Obama's Cat Food Commission and the attempts to say, well, Social Security is in trouble and we've got to reform it, will be a feature of the new administration, once again, regardless of who's president. Stuart Hall says, come on, the NHS is one of the most humanitarian acts that has ever been undertaken in peacetime. The principle that someone shouldn't profit from someone else's ill health has been lost. Well, of course, we've never had that principle in this country, just the opposite. If someone says an American health company will run the NHS efficiently, nobody can think of the principle to refute that. The guiding principles have been lost. Well, it's a funny way to put it. It's not so much the guiding principles have been lost, but that they've been overwhelmed by a massive education campaign, or miseducation campaign, that the Americans are best at. Our system of constructing the public mind on these issues is second to none. And Stuart Hall can say, well, how has this got lost in Britain? But if he looked at America, of course, he would say it was never here to get lost.
That's what I meant by alluding to what I call social morale and the rhetoric that's being used concerning when we talk about inequality, for example. What comes back from the big rich and their flacks and acolytes is, first of all, it's none of your business. Second,
exactly.
You're saying this only because you're envious.
Yes.
And envy is a ugly problem. And there was even a new one in the Wall Street Journal recently, one writer suggesting that concern about inequality was a form of mental illness.
Where does that come on? I missed that.
Yeah, well, I'll find the reference.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah. This guy Holman, who's writing some of their
Richard Holman,
the ideological pieces.
Oh, yeah.
But it's still on, getting back to my original point about fundamentals and whether one wants to run an economy that it's called capitalism or a welfare state or whatever it is. The idea is to use labor to produce stuff, to use surplus labor to produce stuff in the future, so to invest in the future, so to speak. And how does that actually happen? And it's just so obvious that when you look at the small business climate, we're always talking about the business climate in this country. The countries that have the best business climates for small businessmen are the Northern Europe, in the developed world, are the Northern European and Scandinavian countries. The ones that have the largest welfare states, like Denmark, in which over 50, the tax rate is essentially over 50%, have the highest percentage, the most sort of vibrant small business climates, the highest percentage of workers working in businesses under 100, et cetera, et cetera. It's clear that when those countries, unlike our own, first of all, take care of the health business, just put it off the table, so that isn't a business expense, and so that the cost of health isn't a drag on the whole economy like it is in this country. And then when they provide social supports which create the demand and lessen recessions and so forth, that small business people are and should be happy. And I fail to understand why in this country small business people apparently are so easily fooled by the big business people like Mitt Romney or John Paulson or whatever, that it's that climate being created by them and the Wall Street mentality that is hurting their own businesses. The small business people should be supporting a kind of welfare state. Why aren't they?
Yeah.
As Chomsky says, you have to be highly educated to believe nonsense like that, Yeah. And it is that education, that where Americans are told, well, this will, these methods will in fact harm small business men, and small businessmen then believe them. That's the trick. That's the genius of this American citizen, to get people to misrepresent their own, to misunderstand, misperceive, and misrepresent their own interests. That's pretty hard to do, but we've managed it. You're watching News from Neptune, and today's program has turned into a interesting sort of theoretical discussion of capitalism, and it's a very practical one, it seems to me, because it's precisely the discussion that should be going on and isn't when the political community, decides on the policies of the new government. Since we're suspicious that the policies of the new government have already been decided upon, and that we're not going to have too much input into that, then maybe we don't pay attention to the discussion that should be going on. We're trying to correct that.
Other than that, it may be what this show may be is a symptom of the mental illness that's pervasive in this room.
Diagnosed by Dr. Holman in the Wall Street Journal, right?
Right.
Okay, well, I have another symptom for you then. For one that is long-standing. In good Freudian fashion, we go back to the roots, eh? The infancy of capitalism and to the 18th century Enlightenment, which I've been driven to this regression and defense of the ego, in part by Ron's comments about alienation at a program a couple of weeks ago. And that took me, as I say, back to the Enlightenment, the center of which was the notion that what's central to being human is freedom. Wilhelm von Humboldt, who is, in the view of Noam Chomsky, the most interesting thinker of the 18th century Enlightenment, wrote during the French Revolution, as a matter of fact, I quote, "To inquire and to create, these are the centers around which all human pursuits more or less directly revolve. But all moral culture springs solely and immediately from the inner life of the soul and can never be produced by external and artificial contrivances. The cultivation of the understanding, as of any of man's other faculties, is generally achieved by his own activity, his own ingenuity, or his own methods of using the discoveries of others. Man never regards what he possesses as so much his own as what he does, and the laborer who tends the garden is perhaps in a truer sense its owner than the listless voluptuary who enjoys its fruits." Wonderful 18th century phrase. As I say, the original here is in German, but listless voluptuary is worth the price of admission. And since every truly human action is that which flows from inner impulse, it seems as if all peasants and craftsmen might be elevated into artists, that is, men who love their labor for its own sake, improve it by their own plastic genius and inventive skill, and thereby cultivate their intellect, ennoble their character, and exalt and refine their pleasures. And so humanity would be ennobled by the very things which now, though beautiful in themselves, so often go to degrade it, that is, production of human labor. Freedom is undoubtedly the indispensable condition without which even the pursuits most congenial to individual human nature can never succeed in producing such salutary influences. Whatever does not spring from a man's free choice, or is only the result of instruction and guidance, does not enter into his very being, but remains alien to his true nature. He does not perform it with truly human energies, but merely with mechanical exactness. And if a man acts in a mechanical way, reacting to external demands or instructions, rather than in ways determined by his own interests and energies and power, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is. He becomes another machine in the capitalist mode of production. For Humboldt, then, man is born to inquire and create, and when an adult or a child chooses to inquire or create at his own free choice, then he becomes, in his own terms, an artist rather than a tool of production or a well-trained parrot. This is the essence of the Enlightenment concept of human nature, which we inherit along with capitalism, and it's that, in some sense, the history is capitalism overcoming this notion of human nature or bending it to its own uses by misrepresenting it. It's very revealing and interesting compared with Marx, particularly with the early Marx, and particularly his account of the alienation of labor, when work is external to the worker and not part of his nature, so that he does not fulfill himself in his work, but denies himself and is physically exhausted and mentally debased. This alienated labor that casts some of the workers back into a barbarous kind of work and turns others into machines, thus depriving man of his species character, of free conscious activity, and productive life. Close quote. Recall also Marx's well-known and often quoted reference to a higher form of society in which labor has become not only a means of life, but also the highest want of life. That's the goal expressed usually by Marx by poetry. And recall also his repeated criticism of the specialized labor which mutilates the worker into a fragment of a human being, degrades him to become a mere appurtenance of the machine, makes his work such a torment that its essential meaning is destroyed, estranges from him the intellectual potentialities of the labor process in very proportion to the extent to which science is incorporated into it as an independent power. Marx sees the revolutionary, someone who's objecting to this order and to this system, much more as a frustrated producer than as a dissatisfied consumer. Yeah. The revolutionary is not one who says the system isn't giving me enough. He says the system is not allowing me to be human, to use my capacity, my capacities of head and hands. This far more radical critique of capitalist relations of production flows directly, often in the same words, from the libertarian, in the old sense, libertarian thought of the Enlightenment. For this reason, one must say that classical liberal ideas, and once again, be very careful about classical liberal, different from how we use liberal now, in their essence, though not in the way they developed, are profoundly anti-capitalist. The essence of these ideas, that is the notion of human nature, the essence of these ideas must be destroyed for them to serve as an ideology of modern industrial capitalism. Well, one more burst of this, because the Enlightenment also pointed out that capitalist economic relations, which after all were just beginning in the course of the 18th century, perpetuated a form of bondage which as early as 1767, Simon Linguet had declared to be even worse than slavery, writing, quote, "It's the impossibility of living by any other means that compels our farm laborers to till the soils whose fruits they will not eat, and our masons to construct buildings in which they will not live. It is want that drags them to those markets where they await masters who will do them the kindness of buying them. It is want that compels them to go down on their knees to the rich man in order to get from him permission to enrich him. What effective gain has the suppression of slavery brought him? He is free, you say, but that is his misfortune. These men, it is said, have no master, but they have one, and the most terrible, the most imperious of masters, that is need. It is this that reduces them to the most cruel dependence. And if there's something degrading to human nature in the idea of bondage, as every spokesman of the Enlightenment would insist, then it would follow that a new emancipation must be awaited, what Fourier rendered as the third and last emancipatory phase of history, the first having made serfs out of slaves, the second wage earners out of serfs, and the third which will transform the proletariat freeman by eliminating the commodity character of labor, ending wage slavery, and bringing the commercial, industrial, and financial institutions under democratic control. Now, that division has been with us since the 18th century. That division, that's part of normal political discussion in America in the 19th century. It's part of political discussion that is erased, and it's interesting how it comes to be erased, in 20th century political discussion. And here we are in the 21st century with no concept of the issue. We don't see the problem. We don't understand at all that capitalism, the system of production in which we live and move and have our being, is literally robbing us of our humanity, our capacity for the exercise of our talents of head and hands. That's a pretty strong indictment, it seems to me. One we should remember.
Yeah, there are places where you can see something like this happening, the difference it makes. My friend Quentin moved to Mexico a couple of years ago, and there the transition in southern Mexico is going on from the subsistence farmers to those who are raising cash crops and participating more in the money economy. And what that's doing to them personally, culturally, and so on is kind of eye-opening. But.
Yeah, I've also been looking back a little at the populist movement in this country, which gets sort of popular, no pun intended, and perhaps faddish every so often, historically speaking, as a very unusual, allegedly unusual, and even anomalous phase in this country. But I think what the historians of the populist movement from the 1870s through the 1890s point out in this country is that it had very deep roots in earlier politics, in earlier labor and working man politics. It had roots in Jeffersonian politics, and that, as Carl refers to producerism as opposed to consumerism, the populist movement, the farmers' rebellion in this country in the post-Civil War era, was very much a producerist movement. It was a complicated movement. It was complicated by issues of race. It's sort of perhaps gotten less attention academically because it didn't necessarily feed into Marxist movements in Europe at that time. It sort of assumes a different status, I think, in the minds of some people on that basis. But I think it's at least important to understand the populist movement as it evolved before it became the Populist Party in the 1890s, and find out what that is, and that we have a history in this country of popular rebellion against the kind of capitalist forces, the kind of sort of onerous capitalist forces that we also have at this time.
And as Chomsky points out, one of the places where this sort of populism is, to, in some sense, everyone's amazement, being reborn in our own time is South America. That the sweep of left governments that have come to power in the last decade across South America are raising all these questions again. And the furious denunciation of Chavez in Venezuela, the furious denunciation of the governments of Bolivia and Brazil and so forth are in part based on the fact that the American 1% understands that this is a very deep challenge to who and what they are, and that our comfortable use of South America as our backyard over the last 2 centuries may be coming to an end as another aspect of American decline, where American decline is understood as an assault on the privileges of the American 1%. They're scared. They really are. And God willing, they'll get more scared.
And in that light, just to conclude by saying that it's interesting how the word populist becomes a kind of dirty political word in our own culture.
Right.
There are some liberals that have to do with that every bit as much as conservative or people that are identify with the so-called right.
You've been watching News from Neptune for October 26th in the 43rd week of 2012. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been the Eid Mubarak Happy Eid edition. On the occasion of Eid al-Adha, the Muslim feast of sacrifice, marking the end of the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. If our program has interested you might want to look at similar programs here on Urbana Public Television, which, by the way, is now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org/livestream. Tomorrow at 7 a.m., The David Pakman Show. At 8 a.m. In Focus. At 2 p.m., this program will be repeated. And at 3 p.m., The Populist Dialogues. Sunday, 7:30 a.m., White House Chronicle. 3:30 p.m., The Populist Dialogues. And at 4 p.m., Labor's Worldview returns with our friend David Johnson and Jim Iman. And recommend this program particularly. I was talking to David about what they're going to do on this program, and that will be 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon, particularly important. Every weekday, Monday through Friday, at 7 a.m., Democracy Now!, at 8 a.m., The Big Picture, and at noon, The David Pakman Show. Monday, Labor's Worldview is repeated at 1. The Tom Hartman program, a live 3-hour nationwide call-in at 2 p.m., and European Journal at 5. And then on Tuesday, repeats of several of these programs, and at 10 p.m., Aware on the Air. You won't want to miss another episode of that either. In fact, all 3 of us turn up on that episode of Aware on the Air. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune
Strangely
have been
enough.
David Green and Ron Szoke. This and other editions of this program can be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I'm happy to receive your comments, and let me know if you'd ever like to substitute for one of our regulars when they're not available. Our thanks to UPTV, as usual, especially Jake, Jason, and Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.